Welcome back to our study in the book of Colossians. We're in chapter 3 and we finished up our last session in verse 8. And in that particular session, we were talking about the things which come out of people's mouths. Sometimes the slander, the obscene speech, malice, anger, wrath, all of these things. And it's very interesting because we as Christians are to rid ourselves of those things. In other words, we're to stop, we're to cease, we're not to talk that way. We are to reflect Jesus Christ in what we do. And that's where we pick up in verse 9 and carry on with the real commission. He says, "Do not lie to one another, since you stripped off the old self with its evil practices." In other words, there's a transition when we come to Christ that changes us from the old person we were to the new person we become. And that's a process. In theological terms, we call that the process of sanctification. Yes, there's an initial being made holy, sanctified, but then there's a process that follows that also. And that process is how we grow in our faith to become and look more like Jesus, and also to live a godly life. And that's where we see it coming out here in verse 10. He says, "And have put on the new self, which is being renewed to a true knowledge according to the image of the one," and that's a capital O on one, which is God, Jesus Christ, who created it. A renewal in which there is no distinction between Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarians, Scythians, slave or free, but Christ is all and in all. He's saying very clearly this is a spiritual transaction. It has nothing to do with your flesh, your body. And it has nothing to do with your ethnicity, because we are really spiritual beings living in human bodies. And that's why Christians of all people should not distinguish in ethnicity, should not distinguish in race, should not distinguish in the differences of who we are in the outward person, what we see. Now, we identify each other, obviously, by looking at our physical appearances, but we look even beyond more than that in the spirit, and we see who we are in Christ. And he says, none of that matters. The Jew nor Greek matters. Paul says that 3 different times, and yet there are a lot of Christians that seem to think that there's a difference between Jewish people and the rest of the world. And in the flesh, there is not. We all have different ethnicities in the flesh, but when we walk by faith in Christ, none of that is apparent to God. None of it matters anymore, because Christ has redeemed the whole world if they choose to accept that salvation. So Christ is all in all. Great thought. We'll pick up there our next time.